En vous remerciant à toutes et à tous d'être présents aujourd'hui, nombreux. Ça montre bien s'il était nécessaire que le sujet interroge et intéresse, bien sûr, vu l'ampleur de la situation et des dégâts, j'ai envie de dire. Merci également au groupe de la GUE, représenté aujourd'hui par Anna Hazekamp, ma collègue, ainsi qu'au groupe des Verts, qui sera représenté par Michel Rivasi, mais qui va nous rejoindre dans quelques minutes. Et bien sûr, à PAN Europe et Public Eye, qui font un travail remarquable et remarqué sur les questions qui vont nous occuper aujourd'hui. Je ne serai pas très long, car les présentations qui vont suivre et les orateurs sont de très bon niveau, et les uns et les autres, nous le savons, mais je voudrais que nous ayons un maximum de temps pour les écouter et ensuite pour échanger. Je m'appelle Éric Andrieux, donc je suis député et j'ai la chance au Parlement européen d'être membre de la commission de l'environnement qui s'occupe de ces questions-là, d'environnement et de santé, mais également membre de la commission de l'agriculture, ce qui me permet de mettre en perspective le thème que nous allons aborder aujourd'hui. Comme nous le savons tous, les nouvelles générations de pesticides, et nous avons travaillé sur le sujet pendant de longs mois dans la commission pesticides que j'ai eu le privilège de présider, utilisés depuis le milieu des années 90, ont des effets délétères sur de nombreux compartiments de la biodiversité. Perturbateurs endocriniens, pesticides, recyclage toxique. L'exposition aux produits chimiques potentiellement dangereux est un enjeu majeur au niveau environnemental et sanitaire. Et je fais partie de ceux qui pensent qu'il est essentiel, bien sûr, de protéger davantage les Européens face à ces risques. Nous avons, en juillet dernier, déposé un texte, ici même au Parlement européen, exigeant le respect, voire le renforcement du principe du pollueur-payeur, une transparence accrue dans le processus d'approbation des substances et dans l'évaluation des risques de celles-ci, davantage de cohérence dans les processus décisionnels nous semble être important donc, et plus que jamais d'actualité. Nous le savons, du maintien de la biodiversité et de la survie des abeilles dépendent de la survie même de l'être humain et il faut sans cesse le répéter ici et ailleurs. Les autorités, qu'elles soient européennes ou nationales, se doivent donc d'être nettement plus ambitieuses qu'elles ne le sont actuellement. Et il y a un certain nombre d'urgences qui doivent être traitées au niveau européen. Et je voudrais juste en rappeler quelques-unes rapidement pour poser un cadre au débat qui va suivre. Je pense qu'il faut tout d'abord améliorer la procédure d'autorisation des pesticides dans l'Union européenne et la rendre plus transparente en accélérant la transition vers des pesticides sans risque. Et nous l'avons dit, et c'est une des conclusions donc, du rapport commis par la commission pesticides. Mais il faut également réduire drastiquement l'utilisation des perturbateurs endocriniens et de facto diminuer leur exposition aux êtres humains et à l'environnement. En second point, il est nécessaire, ce que je voudrais vous dire, de mettre en avant les bons élèves européens et fustiger les gouvernements pour qui l'environnement n'est toujours pas important aujourd'hui. L'usage des pesticides doit devenir un indicateur commun qui rentre en ligne de compte dans l'évaluation des mesures nationales. Telle est ma position au moment où je m'exprime. La PAC, dans un troisième point, et qui est en grande discussion aujourd'hui, qui malheureusement, et je le crains, ne sera pas à la hauteur de nos ambitions, mais doit avoir, pas devrait, doit avoir des mesures fortes qui incitent les agriculteurs à repenser en profondeur leurs pratiques, mais aussi à les accompagner vers des méthodes de production plus durables, leur permettant d'être performants à la fois sur le plan économique, écologique et social. Car j'estime effectivement, et c'est un juste équilibre qu'il nous faut trouver, que les agriculteurs ne doivent pas être perçus comme des ennemis dans ce combat, mais bien comme nos alliés indispensables pour gagner cette bataille dont ils sont partie la solution, même bien plus que le problème. Et c'est un enjeu, et on le voit tous les jours dans nos discussions, et je le dis là en tant que rapporteur de la politique agricole commune. En quatrième point, des moyens bien plus importants doivent être alloués à la recherche pour travailler sur les causes du déclin des abeilles. Je dis ça au moment où nous œuvrons beaucoup sur le plan de relance, dans un moment où on voit bien que les choix ne sont pas bien faits en matière de volume. On trouve des millions pour sauver des banques, mais quand il s'agit de sauver la biodiversité, ça c'est une formule qu'on répète quotidiennement, et les abeilles, par contre, c'est beaucoup plus difficile. Et ce n'est pas normal dans le moment que nous vivons collectivement. Nous entendrons d'ici peu Public Eye, qui partagera avec nous, entre autres, le résultat de leur enquête dans laquelle ils affirment, et je le confirme, que 80 000 tonnes de pesticides toxiques interdits chez nous sont exportés hors Union européenne, particulièrement dans les pays en voie de développement. Au début de cette année, j'avais déjà interpellé la Commission européenne afin de connaître ses intentions pour faire cesser les exportations hors Union européenne de produits phytosanitaires, pourtant interdits en Europe pour des raisons sanitaires. Dans sa réponse, la Commission souligne que les entreprises européennes ou les États qui exportent hors Union ne nécessitent pas d'autorisation préalable de l'Union européenne et que leur seule obligation est de ne pas utiliser ces produits toxiques sur les territoires européens. Inacceptable. En fait, on dit aux États membres et aux grands groupes industriels, faites ce que vous voulez avec vos produits toxiques, mais ne le faites pas chez nous. Cette hypocrisie est totale et ce malaise de pouvoir imaginer qu'aux yeux de certains, pour faire quelques profits, la vie d'un Européen vaut davantage que la vie d'un citoyen du tiers-monde est pour moi simplement indéfendable et totalement inacceptable. Et je voulais le rappeler en début de propos dans cette séquence qui va s'ouvrir. Avec plus de 4 millions de tonnes de pesticides utilisés chaque année dans le monde, des pratiques plus respectueuses de l'environnement et de la santé des animaux, des agriculteurs et des consommateurs n'est pas un caprice. C'est aujourd'hui un impératif. Cet après-midi, nous allons, avec Laurent Gabriel de Public Eye, Angeliki Lisiamachou, je ne sais pas si je prononce bien les mots et vos noms et je m'en excuse, de Pan Europe, le professeur Larissa Bombardi, en direct du Brésil, Basket Tuncat, rapporteur aux Nations Unies, Corinne Lepage, qui fut ministre de l'Environnement en France et députée européenne, et vous tous qui nous suivez, nous allons pouvoir discuter, échanger autour de cette question d'intérêt général pour nous tous et pour les générations à venir. Voilà les quelques mots que je voulais vous donner et vous dire en introduction de ces échanges. Et je suppose qu'Angélique Lisiamachou, représentant de Pan Europe, va rajouter quelques mots avant que nous passions rapidement au premier panel tel qu'il vous a été présenté. Je vous cède la parole.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And I want to thank especially the members of the European Parliament, Eric Andreu, Anya Hazenkamp and Michelle Rivasi for hosting this meeting under these bit controversial circumstances. But as it was already said, hazardous pesticides have a catastrophic impact on human health and the biodiversity, and this is a global issue because we cannot, as Europeans, we should not support any practices that jeopardize human health and the environment elsewhere, especially when we know it. But I'm not going to go into details, just some housekeeping rules. As you all seen, you have a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen where you can ask any question. Since we don't have much time, please keep it to questions rather than statements. And we ask you also to put your name and affiliation so we know who you are. And please, if you have a specific question for a specific panelist, please indicate that as well. Other than that, yes, I want to thank everyone, all the panelists and the speakers for coming here today, and also the interpreters. Thank you. And you can see we have an interpretation option down on the right for English and French. And we're also going to have the Portuguese is also going to be interpreted in English and French. And with this, because we're already 20 minutes past the time, I would like to give the floor to Laurent with the first presentation. Laurent, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, can you see my screen? My presentation, great. Okay, it's a pleasure to be attending this event, and a pleasure to see also so many participants for such an important topic. I directly jump to presenting some of the main findings of our research on the EU's exports of banned pesticides. The general context is the following. The EU is banning more and more substances that are considered too dangerous for use on its own fields, whether they present high risk for the environment or high risk for workers, human health, or consumers exposed. But all of those pesticides that were taken out of the market in recent years, their companies are still allowed to produce them in Europe. That is a practice that is quite widespread, but that remained quite secret for a couple of time. Basically, when a company is willing to produce and export a pesticide that is banned in Europe, it must comply with the PIC regulation. You will hear about that regulation later in more detail, but that's the prior informed consent regulation. So just to be clear, when the EU bans a pesticide, in fact, it bans its use in Europe, but it doesn't. The ban doesn't affect at all the production or the production for export of those chemicals. So the obligation that a company wanting to export a banned pesticide outside Europe must comply with is basically highlighted in the last paragraph in this slide. Basically, they need to file a form which is called an export notification. And this export notification contains a lot of information that is then sent to the importing country. And for some pesticides, the explicit consent of the importing country is required. This is how an export notification looks like. You have basically the exporting country, the importing country, the name of the chemical. Then you have the volumes that will be exported, the date of the first export, the category of the export, because subject to the PIC regulation, you have also industrial chemicals, not only pesticides. The intended use in the importing country, and then you have also the name of the exporter. In this case, it's Syngenta exporting paraquat from the UK. Then you have some information about the risks. Basically, it's the hazard classification in the EU, and then also some information about the reason the chemical was banned. So the European Chemical Agency is issuing every year some report about those exports. But the issue is the data is very much aggregated. If you see, for example, this is a page from their annual report. If you look, for example, at for some chemicals, they group the destination countries. They group the exporting member states, and even for some substances, they group the substance together. For example, if you look at the third line, is you have three chemicals, in fact, grouped together with the volume indicated in the third column, and then several countries mentioning as importing countries, several countries mentioning as exporting countries. So you're not able, in fact, to see what chemicals are exported where, in what quantity, and by whom. So this is why we did our research. How we did it is basically we filed several access to document requests to the European Chemical Agency. The first step was to request a list of all the banned pesticides that were exported in a given year. We choose 2018 from the European Union. We got this list. In fact, there's 52 of them. And so basically 52 pesticides banned in the EU were exported in 2018. And then we had to request for each and every substance from the European Chemical Agency all the export notification to see the exact volumes exported from where to what country, and then see also the names of the companies, and also to do something very important, which was to remove all those exports that were not intended for crop protection use. I give you an example. For example, if you take permethrin, which is quite high on this list, it's number 11, between 1,000 and 10,000 tons of permethrin exported from the EU in 2018. This is an insecticide. It is banned in the EU as crop protection, but it's still approved for use as biocide. And when we checked a sample of export notification, we saw that most of the exports of permethrin were for use as biocide in the importing country. In other words, there is no so-called double standard because the intended use is allowed in the EU. So that was really the next step in the investigation, try to analyze each and every export notification to remove all those exports that were not intended for crop protection. Then we also contacted all the companies and all the countries involved in this trade, confronted them with the data and checked if there were any accuracies. This way we were able for the first time to map the exports of banned pesticides from the EU for a full year. And in fact, I think our investigation revealed for the first time that this is a quite widespread practice. We're not talking about one or two specific chemicals, but very large volumes and a very high numbers of chemicals. So overall, and at first, perhaps a disclaimer about this data. This data, this map that you're seeing here is based on the export notification. The volumes indicated in the export notification are estimates given at the beginning of the year before the export is taking place. And in some cases, the actual volume exported might be higher or lower. And even in some cases, some exports are not taking place. And the second disclaimer I would like to give you is that the volumes that we mention in this map that are displayed in this map include sometimes mixture in which the active substance is only a portion of the product. And in some cases, they relate to the active substance themselves. But that's what we had to do because in the export notification, sometimes the volumes are given for the product, the mixture, and sometimes it's given for the active substances, and you don't have always the concentration that allow you to translate everything into volumes of active substances. And a third disclaimer is that this data that you're seeing here represent only then the exports of banned pesticides for crop protection use in the importing countries. So in other words, we have excluded all of those banned pesticides exported for non-agricultural use. So in terms of the main findings, as you can see, it's more than 80,000 tons, more than 81,000 tons of products containing banned pesticides that were exported from the EU in 2018. We're talking about 41 different pesticides that are banned in the EU that were notified for exports in that year. It's basically coming from many EU member states, in total 11 exporting countries within the EU. But as you can see, the United Kingdom is the main exporter by volume, followed by Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, France, Spain, and Belgium. And together those countries represent about 90% of the volumes exported. The UK is the main exporter, but as you will see, it is mainly because of two substances that they are exporting in very high volumes. If you look at the numbers of chemicals exported, it's France, the #1 country. France exported no less than 18 banned pesticides in 2018 from its own territory. If you look at the importing country, you have in total about 85 importing countries, countries importing those banned pesticides from the EU. The US is the #1 importer. The US is itself also an exporter of banned pesticides to other countries. But behind the US, what you're seeing is in fact that the majority of the exports are going to the so-called low and middle income countries, where in fact regulation is weaker, but also, and most importantly, the risks are higher. And I think that's a critical point. Most of those countries, developing countries, they don't have the capacities to control the risks of those pesticides. And all of those chemicals were banned in the EU because they were too dangerous for use in the EU. So you can imagine the impact they can have in a country like India, South Africa, or Peru. Yes, just to name a few of those countries: Brazil, Ukraine, Mexico, Malaysia, Chile, South Africa, Russia, Vietnam, Peru are all among the top importing countries. Just to give you a bit more information about...
Sorry, it's already 10 minutes. It's already 10 minutes, so if you could
I go quickly.
try to...
Sorry.
Thank
yeah,
you.
a few information about the chemicals. As you can see, the main export is paraquat, which is a very old and toxic pesticide banned for a number of years. It's linked to Parkinson's disease. It's also linked to a number of accidental or intentional poisoning. It's being exported to the US, where in fact Syngenta is being sued by farmers that allege that it caused them Parkinson, but also to Brazil when the pesticides will be banned now. You see also dichloropropene. This is a likely carcinogen according to the US EPA. You see also cyanamide, which is banned in the EU because the exposure of farmers with all the protection in the EU was considered unacceptable. It's a suspected carcinogen and a suspected compound that damage fertility. You have all the list here. Acetochlor is also pretty bad. In total, 41 chemicals. As you can see also the companies, you see some of the biggest companies like Syngenta, Corteva, Bayer, BASF, but also some companies that personally I had never heard about before that investigation. Smaller national companies like Finchimica in Italy or Alzchem in Germany, and some companies in Spain as well. I will just skip those slides because they show just where some selected exporting countries are exporting. But this one is perhaps most interesting. It's a focus on 3 importing countries: Ukraine, Brazil, and South Africa. And as you can see, South Africa is a standout in this investigation by the number of different chemicals they import. The volumes might not be very high in total, but they export about 12 different they import about 12 different banned pesticides from the EU. Ukraine as well is a standout. Maybe we talk about that more later. And it's a bit a sad note because the EU is supposed to have signed an agreement with Ukraine to get our legislation closer together. And what we're seeing is that the country has become a dumping ground for banned pesticides from the EU. Conclusion, some reaction we got from the industry to this report. The main reaction from CropLife, which is representing the main pesticide company in the world, they're saying basically that it's completely normal that some pesticides are approved in other countries and not in the EU. And that's related to agriculture and climate, which are different. This is completely misleading because I want to emphasize that all of the chemicals covered by this investigation have been used sometimes in the EU, but they've been taken out of the market because they were considered too dangerous. So it has nothing to do with whether those pesticides are needed or not within the EU, but the fact that they were taken out of the market because they were too dangerous for use here. And then a statement that probably my colleague Bashkut Tunçek will mention in more detail later, a statement that came out of UN human rights experts calling countries like the EU to stop exporting those the banned pesticides to countries that lack the capacity to control the risk. And finally, the reaction from the Commission, which was a bit a sad note. We got this off the record. So this is not the official reaction of the European Commission, but rather from a source within the Commission. And basically, it's the last paragraph, which is the most important. They're saying that a ban of exports will not lead countries to stop using those pesticides. And it would be rather more effective to talk to them and convince them not to use those pesticides, which is completely true. But basically what the Commission is saying is, we'll try to convince them to stop using, but meanwhile, we'll keep selling them those pesticides. And in our view, this is completely in contradiction with the EU ambition to be a global leader in the transition towards like more sustainable food systems with the farm to fork strategy. The very first step is you stop exporting outside what is too dangerous for use in the EU. Of course, this is only a very first step, and you need other measures to make sure that you achieve a better protection of the environment and the health in those countries, but it's the very basic first step. What is too dangerous for use in the EU is also too dangerous for use outside. And as a conclusion, just to say that, in fact, such a ban would be in the EU's own interest, because when you look at the list of importing countries of destination of those banned pesticides, it's exactly the same list of countries that export back to the EU food, agri-food items. So in fact, you find then residues of those pesticides in the food that is imported in the EU, and you have farmers in the EU complaining that they're exposed to unfair competition. Such an export ban exists already for other cases. You have already an Annex 5 in the PEAK regulation that applies to specific pesticides and chemicals that cannot be exported. It's also the case that asbestos, for example, has been banned. The use has been banned in the EU, but you're not allowed to export asbestos outside. And we believe that the same approach should apply to all pesticides that have been banned owing to their health or environmental effects. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laurent. So now we will have the next presentation from Professor Larissa Bombardi from Sao Paulo University. Larissa, the floor is yours. Please try to stick to the 10 minutes time you have so that we don't run behind schedule too much. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. So
yes, perfectly.
Okay. Apologize, I'm going to speak in Portuguese. Bom, em primeiro lugar, eu quero agradecer à organização esse importante debate, importante para todos nós, muito importante. Eu estou tentando compartilhar minha tela com vocês. Ok. Só um minuto. Quero agradecer particularmente a Angelique pelo convite. Eu vou focar a minha apresentação no impacto dos agrotóxicos, dos pesticidas no ambiente e na infância. Acho que é muito importante que todos saibam, embora imagino que vocês saibam, que o Brasil é o maior consumidor mundial de agrotóxicos e esse consumo tem aumentado ano a ano, mais ou menos 5% a cada ano. Em 2019, infelizmente, o nosso Ministério do Meio Ambiente ainda não autorizou a informação da quantidade de agrotóxicos utilizada, mas como podem ver, nos últimos anos aumentou mais de 25% o uso desses agrotóxicos no Brasil. Isso acontece porque o Brasil é um dos maiores exportadores mundiais de alimentos, que não são só alimentos, mas são commodities, estão também agroenergia. Vejam, o Brasil é o maior exportador mundial de soja. Uma grande parte dessa soja é exportada para a União Europeia ou para a China e para outros países, para alimentar o gado e também para alimentar os porcos. Mais da metade dos agrotóxicos utilizados no Brasil tem como destino a soja, em termos de produto. E isso acontece porque, vejam, a soja hoje no Brasil ocupa uma área equivalente ao território da Alemanha. Veja o mapa que está abaixo. Nós temos uma Alemanha só em soja transgênica no Brasil. Então, isso ajuda a gente a entender por que o Brasil é o maior consumidor de agrotóxicos. Isso tem um claro impacto ambiental. Como vocês podem ver nesse mapa que eu estou mostrando, essa borda verde, esse limite verde corresponde à Amazônia Legal. As cores mais fortes mostram um aumento do número de propriedades rurais que fazem uso de pesticidas. E fica muito claro que a região em que mais aumentou o número de propriedades rurais que fazem uso de pesticidas é a Amazônia brasileira. E quando a gente vê a quantidade de agrotóxicos utilizada no Brasil, o aumento médio da quantidade de pesticidas utilizados no Brasil, a gente vê também claramente que isso tem acontecido na Amazônia brasileira. Então, nós vemos que esse processo da agricultura brasileira, que está voltado basicamente para exportação, ele tem um impacto muito severo do ponto de vista ambiental. Aqui nós temos um mapa com o aumento do uso de agrotóxicos, pesticidas por municípios. E fica bastante evidente que os municípios do chamado Arco do Desmatamento da Amazônia, a porção sudeste da Amazônia brasileira, foi aqueles em que mais aumentou o uso de agrotóxicos. Nesse próximo mapa, nós temos o desmatamento na Amazônia. E acho muito importante que vocês percebam como estas duas áreas elas correspondem. São dois problemas ambientais que estão absolutamente associados. O desmatamento da Amazônia está associado ao avanço da agricultura sobre esse bioma. E este mapa, finalmente, somando as informações dos dois anteriores, nós temos um arco do desmatamento da Amazônia claramente marcado com o aumento do uso de agrotóxicos. Então, nesse mapa, nós temos os municípios em que mais aumentou o desmatamento e mais aumentou o uso de agrotóxicos. Então, está muito claro que esse padrão inserção do bem.
Larissa, we cannot hear you anymore. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Okay.
can hear you.
I'm sorry. So, esse mapa, ele mostra exatamente as áreas em que mais aumentou o desmatamento, são aquelas em que mais aumentou os de agrotóxicos. Aqui nós temos os 7 agrotóxicos mais vendidos no Brasil. E estes pesticides, if you prefer, os 7 pesticidas mais agrotóxicos, pesticidas. Esses pesticidas que estão circulados são proibidos na União Europeia. O paraquat está em vias de ser proibido no Brasil, mas nós temos estoques enormes dessa substância ainda, mesmo que ele esteja em processo de proibição. Há uma diferença enorme também, não só com relação aos pesticidas que nós autorizamos no Brasil, mas também ao limite de resíduos que nós permitimos. Aqui vocês podem ver que nós autorizamos um resíduo de glifosato na água potável 5 vezes superior ao limite de glifosato permitido na água potável na União Europeia. Isso tem um impacto severo na saúde humana. Mais de 48 mil pessoas se intoxicaram com agrotóxicos nos últimos anos. Mas nós calculamos que possivelmente foram 2,4 milhões de pessoas intoxicadas, porque o nosso Ministério da Saúde calcula que para cada caso notificado, nós temos 50 outros casos não notificados. É um problema enorme de saúde pública e é, de alguma forma, um ataque à infância, infanticídio, porque cerca de 17% da população intoxicada são crianças e adolescentes entre 0 e 19 anos. Eu penso que isso é um escândalo, é uma tragédia do ponto de vista humano. Aqui nós temos um mapa só sobre crianças intoxicadas com agrotóxicos entre 1 e 14 anos. Foram mais de 4.000 crianças intoxicadas com agrotóxicos no Brasil, entre 1 e 14 anos, nos últimos anos. E uma parte dessas intoxicações estão relacionadas, inclusive, a tentativas de suicídio. Crianças que tentaram se suicidar ingerindo pesticidas. Eu não tenho outra palavra para definir isso, a não ser uma tragédia. Nós tivemos mais de 2.800 crianças que tentaram se suicidar nos últimos anos no Brasil ingerindo agrotóxico. É uma situação que não está controlada sob muitos aspectos. Finalmente, para ir fechando a minha apresentação, eu queria dizer que uma das informações que mais me chocou ao desenvolver minha pesquisa foi lidar com casos de bebês intoxicados com agrotóxicos, bebês entre 0 e 12 meses. Quer dizer, são bebês que nem se locomovem sozinhos, que não podem estar envolvidos no universo do trabalho e, mesmo assim, foram intoxicados com pesticidas. Nós tivemos, entre 2007 e 2019, 625 bebês intoxicados com agrotóxicos. Possivelmente, isso é um número muito maior, possivelmente, se nós formos considerar que para cada caso notificado nós temos 50 outros não notificados, talvez tenhamos tido mais de 30.000 bebês intoxicados com agrotóxicos no Brasil nesse período. Então, eu acho que esse é um quadro gravíssimo. Eu quero fechar a minha apresentação dizendo que uma parte desses mapas estão disponíveis nesse link, uma pequena, na verdade, os mapas que eu trouxe hoje a maior parte são novos, mas uma parte está aí disponível. Dizer que eu considero essa situação uma tragédia humana e ambiental, dizer que eu considero isso inaceitável e de novo, agradecer e insistir na importância desse evento que está sendo organizado hoje, que eu penso que é imperioso, é necessário que a gente caminhe no sentido de uma regulação internacional para agrotóxicos. Não é possível que a gente lide com padrões tão diferentes para agrotóxicos, para pesticidas e todos os químicos no geral, mas para pesticidas em particular. Precisamos pensar o sentido do alimento, resgatar o alimento enquanto alimento, e não apenas como mercadoria. Muito obrigada novamente pelo convite de tomar parte nesse evento.
Thank you very much, Larissa, for your very interesting presentation. Now I give the floor to Angeliki Lysimakou from Pesticide Action Network Europe.
Yes, thank you, Marta. Let me share my screen. Thank you also for the two impactful presentations. I agree it's unacceptable that Europe sells pesticides, knowing that they are hazardous to human health and the environment, to third countries, that they have weaker regulations when it comes to human and environmental protection. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I hope you can see it. So a question from our side, from the European side, was it was, okay, that's it. It was that we know that the pesticide regulation, as we said, it aims to ensure that pesticide active substances, products, and residues should have no harmful effect to human, animals, and the environment. So our question was, so when we ban a pesticide, do we actually then detect it in European food? For this, the methodology we carried was we were based on the member state official monitoring pesticide residues in food program of 2018 data that was published this year, and this is it composes 93,153 samples. So we screen all these database to find a banned pesticide. We use, as was mentioned in the first presentation, we use the PIC list, as we know, where pesticides that they banned, they enter this list so they can be notified in exports. So we only used pesticides that they were included in the list before 2018. So this is around 160 substances. And before entering into the actually banned pesticide, just to remind us that the food that we eat contains cocktails of pesticides. And here we have done a comparison of food produced in Europe and food produced outside Europe. And you can see in all cases, the imported food is the one that contains most pesticides, and also food with most often with mixtures of pesticides. So what our analysis shows, which is going to be published this afternoon, you will be able to read it. We found that 74 pesticides were detected. This was in 5,811 samples. It's 6.2%. It might sound small to you, but it actually, because we have included all types of samples, including organic and baby food, for example, that they shouldn't have residues. So this is actually quite high. And if we compare it to other pesticides that they authorized in Europe, it's in the much higher rank. Most of it is plant-based, as you can see in this graph, because this is the food items are the most assessed. A small comparison, unfortunately, most banned pesticides were found, and not most, but a higher percentage of food with banned pesticide was the one from unknown origin. So maybe it's not by coincidence and should be monitored. But then we see that when it comes to plant-based food, that imported food has twice as much banned residues as food produced in the EU. Now, from animal-based products, which is it was a smaller number of samples, the picture is a little bit different, and we found that actually food produced in Europe has banned pesticides, and this is because of persistent organic pollutants that have been used in the past in agriculture, most probably. So here, I invite you to have a look at the report for full details, but here's the top 35 pesticides that we detected. You see that carbendazim, this is a fungicide that was banned in 2014 because it's highly toxic. It's actually mutagenic and toxic to reproduction. It was found in 1,600 samples. But also other pesticides that have been banned either for because they're highly toxic to the environment, to bees or the aquatic environment, or to humans were also detected. What we did following the first study, the study done by Public Eye and Greenpeace on Earth, we did a comparison with the list of the 41 pesticides that they found notifications for exports, and we cross-checked it with our list, and we found that actually 22 of these 41 pesticides are detected in European food. And here, if we see in this graph, the orange bar shows the imports, and you can see in most cases, actually it's 19 cases out of the 22, imported food has more of this pesticide substance than food produced in EU. So it's evident that these pesticides come back to Europe. If we look at overall picture, we see that teas were on the top of the list of where you can most often find banned pesticides, and it's a bit concerning, the numbers. Here's in the sum, you can see how many pesticides all tea samples were detected, and you can see the numbers are quite high. 25, and you see even in herbs like 34. But also, if you see further down in fruits, we found there's up to 50 pesticides have been detected. So if we look into focus and we examine each batch of samples that has been analyzed by the member states, for example, here you see milk from the Czech Republic. In this case, 80% of the samples were found to have one or more banned pesticides. And then you see for specific analysis, the situation is it's worse. And we have here, for example, is the first 30, you can see starts from 45% of food. I won't go into too much detail because I don't have the time, but just to let you know that exotic fruit was also on the top of the list, together with teas and spices. And then when we look the countries of origin, we found in the few samples sent from Malaysia, Laos, and Iran, we had really a high percentage of food with these residues. But then if we look where the most residues come from, we found it was 30 were detected in food from China, 25 from India, then Thailand, Brazil, Vietnam, Morocco, and Peru. And many of these countries are also the ones that were found by the investigation by Public Eye and Greenpeace on Earth to actually be exported, the pesticides are exported. So in our conclusions, banned pesticides are detected in European food, in imported food predominantly, but also in food produced in Europe. And just to highlight that the MRLs are not always set to 0 following a ban, so it's legal to detect banned residues in food. This is because some pesticides have only been banned because of environmental toxicity, so they are considered safe for consumption for some reason, for human health. Then we've seen that in some cases, international MRLs or import tolerance are not deleted. And as we saw in the case of carbendazim, the reason it's still legal to be detected in food is because it has a parent compound that hasn't been banned. And of course, by this way, if it's legal to be detected in food, we have no control to assess whether it's been used in Europe or not. And evidently, we're supporting these practices to take place elsewhere. So just 2 points, very brief. We agree with what's been said before. We want to stop the exports of banned pesticides. What's dangerous, what is considered dangerous in Europe, it's dangerous elsewhere. And an urgent measure we can take is to adopt a zero tolerance for pest policy for banned pesticides in food. And with this, I'm going to close. Thank you very much and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angeliki, for your interesting presentation. Mr. Andrieux, for the sake of the time, do you agree we pass to the next panel and keep the questions for the end?
Oui, merci. Merci beaucoup. Merci vraiment aux 3 intervenants et pour cet éclairage stupéfiant, voilà, à tous les instants. Voilà, mais donc on va y revenir dans le débat et je vais, passer au second panel en donnant la parole, parce qu'on se reçoit de M. Basket-Tuncat, qui est rapporteur aux Nations Unies, avec qui nous allons aborder la question des exportations de pesticides sous l'angle des droits humains, avant d'écouter Corinne Lepage, que j'ai présentée tout à l'heure. Donc on enchaîne tout de suite, comme ça laissera la place aux échanges et aux commentaires tout à l'heure. Donc on passe au second panel. Donc je vous invite bien sûr à poser vos questions sur le chat commun, donc que l'on prendra le maximum finalement dans la dernière séquence de nos échanges. Donc la parole est de M. Basket-Tuncat. Allez-y, vous pouvez commencer le second panel.
Merci, Monsieur André. Thank you very much to PAN, to Public Eye, members of the European Parliament, Commission representatives as well. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Good. Cool. So thank you again for the invitation to participate in this very important discussion. Greatly appreciate the invitation. Just for clarification, I am now the former Special Rapporteur on hazardous substances and wastes. I ended my duties a month ago, but nevertheless, I'm very pleased to be able to share a few thoughts, as this issue of exports, toxic exports, has been a reoccurring issue under the 6 years in which I held tenure of the mandate on human rights and toxics. Indeed, the European Union has been a leader for many years in working to prevent and minimize exposure to toxic substances. For example, the EU was a leader in fighting the injustice of hazardous waste being exported to low and middle income countries. As some of you may know, a ban on the export of hazardous waste to non-OECD countries came into effect at the end of last year under the Basel Convention. But well before this global ban, the so-called Basel ban, the EU had already restricted such exports under its own laws. And in my view, this is leadership, and this is certainly a wonderful example of the EU leading by example. All states have a duty to prevent and minimize exposure to hazardous substances, not just wastes, to protect human rights. Accordingly, over the years, the EU has strengthened its laws for industrial chemicals and pesticides. EU laws are now considered by myself and others to be among the world's best in many regards, particularly in upholding principles of human rights and preventing and minimizing exposure. But while the EU laws have grown stronger over several years, they regrettably created a large loophole for their chemical industry, which unfortunately allows the continued manufacture and export of substances that Laurent mentioned to countries with far weaker systems to manage the chemical risks. The ability to manufacture and to export toxic substances that are banned from use domestically is one, albeit a large element of how states have institutionalized the toxic externalities on vulnerable communities around the world. These loopholes are essentially a political concession to the European chemical industry, and European policymakers have the power to address this injustice. These exports are contributing to an ongoing human rights violation and an abuse of human rights as well in countries all over the world. EU member states have an extraterritorial obligation under international human rights law to close this loophole, as was called by 36 rapporteurs and experts of the UN Human Rights Council earlier this summer, which Laurent mentioned in his presentation. In our view, it's long overdue that states stop this exploitation. For over the past 5 years, UN human rights mechanisms have increasingly drawn attention to human rights violations and abuses around the world from exposure to pesticides. Repeatedly, the violations concern the exposure of disadvantaged, sensitive, and vulnerable groups. For example, indigenous peoples, people of African descent, migrants, ethnic minorities, low-income communities, and as Larissa mentioned in her presentation, with children among these groups at considerably greater risk. In 2015, for example, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child reported on grave violations of child rights among the Yaqui indigenous community in Mexico from pesticide exposure. Children and families in agricultural communities have died and endured serious health impairments from exposure to toxic pesticides that are banned in use from the countries in which they are exported, which includes Europe. Last year, regarding Paraguay, the UN Human Rights Committee found grave violations of the rights to life and a life with dignity from the relentless exposure of communities to pesticides. In Guatemala, the special procedures of the UN Human Rights Council have alleged human rights violations from the death of tens of thousands of fish, which decimated the food and the livelihood, and in essence, the human rights of local communities that depended on the river and its ecosystem for their way of life. In Indonesia, in India, in Argentina, in Zimbabwe, among many other countries, UN human rights mechanisms have also reported and alleged various human rights abuses and violations from pesticide use. Global supply chains, including those going to and from Europe, are clearly implicated in all of these violations. In my recent visit to Brazil, I found grave human rights violations from the use of pesticides there. I won't repeat everything that Larissa said, but I will just add a few additional points from my visit. One of the things I heard repeatedly was the heartbreaking stories of indigenous and Afro-Brazilian communities who are being driven from their lands by pesticide spraying, which is what they call chemical weapons. Homes and even schools are regularly engulfed with toxic fumes of pesticides by agrobusinesses. And the violations of human rights are profound and wide-ranging, and hardly any victim there has any semblance of a right to an effective remedy. According to the discussions I had with the government there, 30% of pesticides used in Brazil are not authorized in Europe. Brazil also ranks consistently as one of the countries that is the most deadly for human rights defenders. 10 years ago, Jose Maria Dotomi was shot over 20 times for his efforts to defend the rights of his community from aerial spraying. He died for his advocacy, and to this day, there is unfortunately no legitimate inquiry into his death in pursuit of accountability. And this is only one example. The threat faced by human rights defenders fighting for a healthy agriculture and livelihoods is being driven by unsustainable consumption and production around the world, including in Europe. Countless communities in the countries in which Europe is exporting toxic chemicals to do not want these unwanted toxic pesticides. They complain of cancers, they complain of respiratory diseases and disabilities, neurodevelopmental impacts, congenital malformations, and infertility among the community. If not threats and harassment, they face inordinate burdens of trying to prove causation between these health impacts and their exposures, or systems that simply will not respond to any level of proof of harm. Many are fighting, but their voices are not being heard. Europe must not contribute to the human rights violations and abuses that are happening around the world via these toxic exports. The racial undertones of these exports, the exploitation of these double standards, they cannot be ignored. States have human rights obligations to respect and protect human rights outside their borders, and this applies without question to the export of pesticides that are banned from use in Europe. It is a mistake, in my view, to think that the problem of human rights violations and abuses outside Europe from European pesticides are not Europe's problem. To reiterate, in July, 36 independent experts and special rapporteurs of the UN Human Rights Council have called on states to stop exporting unwanted chemicals to poorer countries. I was pleased to join this call and reiterate that call here today. The EU and its member states should follow the lead of France and others and stop exporting chemicals that are banned from use domestically for human health or environmental reasons. Just to conclude, as my predecessor wisely noted, just because it's legal does not mean that it is moral. A carcinogen in Europe is a carcinogen everywhere. It doesn't become less toxic in Latin America, in Asia, or in Africa. And as was mentioned before, to the contrary, the risks are far, far greater. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Baskut. Now I give the floor to Corinne Lepage, to environmental lawyer and former MEP.
Merci beaucoup. Merci pour votre invitation. Merci à Éric Andrieux de m'avoir invité et à PAN, avec lequel je suis si honorée de travailler dans le cadre de l'association Justice Pesticides, dont je rappelle que son ambition est de publier toutes les décisions rendues en matière de pesticides dans le monde entier pour que tout le monde puisse bénéficier des progrès jurisprudentiels. Alors, on m'a demandé de parler d'une décision importante qui est une décision qui a été rendue par le Conseil constitutionnel français le 31 janvier 2020. La question posée était la suivante. La loi française peut-elle interdire l'exportation de pesticides contenant des substances prohibées par l'Union européenne en raison de leur impact sur la santé humaine et sur l'environnement, alors même que l'usage de ces produits est autorisé dans les pays vers lesquels ils sont exportés? On est en plein dans notre sujet. Autrement dit, l'interdiction à compter du 1er janvier 2022 de la production, du stockage et de la circulation de produits phytopharmaceutiques contenant des substances actives non approuvées pour des raisons liées à la protection de la santé humaine ou de l'environnement porte-t-elle atteinte à la Constitution française et en particulier à la liberté d'entreprendre? Je rappellerai que la liberté d'entreprendre ne se trouve pas que dans la Constitution française, mais se trouve également dans les actes fondateurs de l'Union européenne. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est que le Conseil constitutionnel a répondu oui, en faisant prévaloir un objectif de valeur constitutionnelle donné à l'environnement et à la santé humaine sur la liberté d'entreprendre. La protection de l'environnement figure dans le préambule de la Charte de l'environnement, dont la valeur constitutionnelle a été reconnue, mais c'est dans le préambule de la Charte, pas dans les articles de la Charte. Ça n'a donc pas la même valeur juridique. Le Conseil constitutionnel, je vous fais grâce des décisions, des dates de décision, mais je les tiens à la disposition de ceux qui les voudraient, ayant jugé il y a déjà quelques années que si le préambule a une valeur constitutionnelle, aucune de ces dispositions n'institue un droit ou une liberté que la Constitution garantit. Cependant, on avait eu déjà une première avancée avec une décision rendue à propos des gaz de schiste, de la fracturation hydraulique, où le Conseil constitutionnel avait retenu que le législateur poursuivait un but d'intérêt général de la protection de l'environnement. Puis, à propos des néocotinoïdes, le sujet est toujours d'actualité, le Conseil constitutionnel avait jugé en 2016 que la protection de l'environnement était un objectif d'intérêt général. Ici, un nouveau pas est franchi, puisque la protection de l'environnement est reconnue comme un objectif de valeur constitutionnelle au même titre que la santé. Et cet objectif de valeur constitutionnelle, que, j'ouvre une parenthèse, on retrouve dans notre droit communautaire, dans les principes fondamentaux du droit communautaire. On l'a dans la Charte des citoyens, on a les principes de protection de l'environnement dans le traité unique, donc on a tout ce qu'il faut, si je puis dire, peut justifier une atteinte à la liberté d'entreprendre à la condition qu'elle ne soit pas disproportionnée. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on entend par disproportionné? Il y avait un précédent qui avait été rendu en France par le Conseil constitutionnel à propos du bisphénol A. On a parlé des perturbateurs endocriniens tout à l'heure. Et là, le Conseil constitutionnel avait jugé que la suspension de la fabrication et de l'exportation en France de ce produit apportait des restrictions excessives à la liberté d'entreprendre dans la mesure où d'autres pays continuaient à exporter et que de toute façon, les pays d'importation étaient d'accord pour recevoir ces produits. Aujourd'hui, 2020, c'est une décision contraire qui est rendue, puisque bien que ces produits litigieux soient acceptés dans les pays d'accueil, le Conseil constitutionnel considère que la protection de l'environnement doit être entendue dans un sens large qui excède le territoire français. On est donc tout à fait dans la logique de ce qui vient d'être rappelé par les uns et par les autres, qu'un produit n'est pas moins cancérigène parce qu'il est consommé au Brésil ou qu'il est consommé en Afrique que s'il est consommé en Europe, ou tout au moins utilisé. C'est donc très intéressant parce qu'on se situe dans le préambule de la Charte qui considère que l'environnement est non pas le patrimoine commun de la nation, vision nationale qui figure dans la loi française, mais patrimoine commun de l'ensemble des êtres humains. Donc, on est dans une vision universelle. C'est une conception qui paraît évidente sur le plan éthique. J'en ai parlé tout à l'heure, c'est injustifiable. Mais sur le plan juridique, c'est quand même relativement original et cela mérite, à mon sens, d'être diffusé. J'en dirai un mot dans quelques instants. C'est donc une interprétation qui est très riche de perspectives. En jugeant que le législateur, je cite, est fondé à tenir compte des effets que les activités en France peuvent apporter à l'environnement à l'étranger, le Conseil constitutionnel ouvre une voie à quantité de problèmes, et je pense en particulier au climat et à la biodiversité qui excèdent aujourd'hui notre domaine de réflexion, et qui, bien entendu, sont tous dans nos têtes. À partir du moment où on considère que la légalité d'une décision ne s'apprécie pas seulement dans le pays dans lequel joue la loi, mais s'applique également à l'étranger, eh bien, évidemment, on rentre dans des perspectives qui sont tout à fait différentes et rien n'empêcherait, sur le plan des principes à l'Union européenne, d'aller dans la même logique. Car si chacun se considère aujourd'hui comme évident le fait que non seulement les émissions de gaz à effet de serre liées aux importations soient prises en compte dans le calcul des émissions d'un pays, il va de soi que la question de l'appréhension planétaire du sujet n'est plus l'objet d'aucune discussion. Il en va de même de la biodiversité et, par exemple, l'application des critères ILUC en Europe s'inscrit dans cette logique. Je rappelle que c'est les critères utilisés pour apprécier l'impact réel des agrocarburants. S'agissant de la santé, stricto sensu, on peut considérer que la décision en cause tranche la question, y compris de la santé à l'étranger. De fait, le lien que la décision du 30 janvier établit entre la santé et l'environnement, lien constant au niveau communautaire, vous le savez bien, mesdames et messieurs les députés, est particulièrement important et prometteur dans la mesure où, jusqu'à présent, le droit de chacun à vivre dans un environnement équilibré et respectueux de la santé, affirmé à l'article 1er de la Charte de l'environnement, ne fait pas réellement l'objet d'une sanction de la part du Conseil constitutionnel. Il a jusqu'à présent considéré que tous les débats autour des questions de santé environnementale mettent en cause des appréciations scientifiques et techniques sur lesquelles il n'a pas le moyen de s'exprimer. Comme l'écrit très clairement le professeur Parence dans un article paru au Dalloz, page 159, en dégageant l'objectif de protection de l'environnement et en le combinant à celui de la santé, le Conseil constitutionnel s'est donné les armes pour promouvoir une défense plus efficace de l'environnement et peut-être des questions de santé environnementale. Le débat juridique, actuellement très vif en France, mais pas que, sur la question du glyphosate, je ne dis pas que parce que les tribunaux de l'Union européenne, le tribunal de l'Union européenne est saisi à ma connaissance au moins de 2 procès, l'un fait par la région Bruxelles-Capitale contre la décision initiale de l'Union européenne de 2017, l'autre que j'ai eu l'honneur d'introduire pour le collectif des maires anti-pesticides pour le refus de la Commission de réviser sa position, montre bien que le sujet est bien de nature européenne. Peut-être qu'un jour, le Conseil constitutionnel aura l'occasion de se prononcer, mais ce que je veux dire, c'est qu'il serait intéressant que cette jurisprudence puisse être connue, puisse être diffusée et qu'elle connaisse le même succès que la jurisprudence Urgenda, jurisprudence des Pays-Bas, mais qui aujourd'hui sert en quelque sorte de référence à tous les procès de justice climatique qui se déroulent dans le monde, où que ce soit, comme étant en quelque sorte l'orientation, la direction vers laquelle il faut aller. Reconnaître le droit pour un État, mais c'est la même chose pour les institutions européennes, d'interdire l'exportation de produits qui sont interdits à l'utilisation dans nos États, c'est tout simplement permettre de faire prévaloir la santé humaine, où qu'elle soit, sur la liberté d'entreprendre, et ce n'est pas, à mon sens, une position qui est disproportionnée. Je vous remercie.
Merci vraiment à Mascout Tunkak et à Corinne Lepage pour ces propos ciselés, d'une précision voilà, donc implacable. Enfin, merci. Et du coup, je vous propose d'entrer dans la troisième partie, qui n'est pas la dernière, hein, puisqu'il y aura les questions des différents participants. Mais pour passer la parole à la Commission, tout d'abord au docteur Jürgen Elbig, représentant la DG Envie, ensuite à M. Rémi Lefebvre, représentant l'ECA, et Klaus Behrendt, directeur de la DG Santé. Peut-être ce sera intéressant d'avoir vos réactions comment dire, aux deux panels qui étaient, je trouve, équilibrés finalement, à la fois avec des enquêtes et des constats donc assez, j'allais dire implacables, mais dans tous les cas, donc, qui pour le moins nous interrogent. Donc voilà. Et donc je voudrais sans plus attendre vous céder la parole, peut-être en commençant par la DG Envie avec le docteur Jürgen Elbig. Je vous cède la parole.
Thanks a lot.
Alors, juste un dernier mot, en vous remerciant d'essayer de parler lentement pour faciliter la tâche de nos interprètes, nous dit-on.
Yes, thanks a lot, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. I will share my screen now because I have a short presentation. So I hope you can see my screen now. I don't see it anymore. Well, we are discussing here the international trade of certain hazardous chemicals, or in particular pesticides, and also the so-called double standards, because we apply different rules to exports as compared to our internal market. Well, the main topic of this discussion is on the rules on exports of those hazardous chemicals and pesticides. And I would like to recall that there's an international instrument dealing with the export of hazardous chemicals and pesticides in international trade, and this is the Rotterdam Convention. And what we are doing in the European Union, we implement that Rotterdam Convention. But before giving some information on the way how we implement, I would like to recall some of the rules of the Rotterdam Convention. The Rotterdam Convention, and those who know, is on the prior informed consent procedure for certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides in international trade. And the main objectives is to promote shared responsibility in the international trade, to protect human health and the environment, and to contribute to the environmentally sound use of those chemicals subject to the convention. The main tool that is used to achieve the objective is the exchange of information under the Rotterdam Convention. And there are various mechanisms to exchange information. The first mechanism is the listing in Annex 3 to the Convention, which is the most important mechanism. And this listing is based on so-called notifications of final regulatory action that are submitted by parties to the Secretariat of the Convention and that are made available to all parties. And already this notification of final regulatory action is also a means to inform other parties about action taken and the reasons why this action has been taken. Once a chemical is listed in Annex 3 to the Convention, then all parties are requested to submit their so-called import response. And this import response is to inform all other parties whether a party agrees or not to the import of a chemical that is listed. And these import responses are made available to all other parties, and all parties are requested to apply the import response. So if a country in Africa says, we do not agree to the import of a chemical X that is listed in Annex 3, then all parties are requested to follow that import response and to no longer export the chemical to this country. In addition to this mechanism, which is the prior informed consent mechanism, the PIC mechanism, all parties are required to notify the export of chemicals that are banned in their territory to importing countries. And this again, it's a mechanism to inform other parties about regulatory action taken on chemicals and the reasons why this action is taken. And in the Union, we implement the Rotterdam Convention by regulation, and it has already been mentioned, by the PIC regulation, which has as a first objective implementing the convention, but it goes even beyond the convention, and it provides more restrictive rules on the export than the convention as such. The chemicals that are covered by the PIC regulation are those chemicals that are banned or severely restricted in the European Union, be it as a pesticide or as a biocide or as an industrial chemical. And in addition, those chemicals that are subject to the Rotterdam Convention and are listed in Annex 3 to the Convention, they are also subject to the PIC regulation. The list of the chemicals for which the rules on the export of the PIC regulation apply is regularly updated based on the developments in Union law. So once a new decision has been taken to ban a pesticide for placing on the market in the Union, then this pesticide is listed in the PIC regulation, and also developments under the convention. So listings of chemicals in Annex 3 to the convention are reflected in the PIC regulation. I already said that the PIC regulation restricts exports more than the convention, and it does it in several ways. The export notification procedure, which is within the heart of the convention, also the regulation, applies to about 226 chemicals at this moment that are banned or severely restricted in so-called subcategory of a convention use category. Those who are familiar with the convention, they know that the convention knows two use categories, pesticide and industrial chemical. In the European Union, we established subcategories to the convention use categories, and we already notify the export of those chemicals that are banned or severely restricted in a subcategory, which has the effect that we notify, in fact, a lot more exports than required by the convention. In addition, we notify the export to any country, and not only to the parties of the convention, and irrespective of their use. So if they are banned or severely restricted as pesticide, but then they are exported as industrial chemical, we notify this export. In addition to the export notification procedure, we have the explicit consent procedure, and this applies to all chemicals, and currently it's about 120 that are banned or severely restricted in the European Union in the convention use category, so either as pesticide or as industrial chemical. And the vast majority of those chemicals that have been subject to the data shown by public eye, which are in fact quite interesting data, and the presentation of the flows of the trade is very interesting, but the vast majority of those chemicals, they are only exported if the importing country consents to the export. So the vast majority of those that are currently exported are in fact subject to the explicit consent mechanism. And last year, just to give you an example, the European Union submitted 1,500 requests for explicit consent to importing countries. And then in addition, we apply also the explicit consent procedure to those chemicals that are listed in the Rotterdam Convention, Annex 3, but for which an import decision from the importing country is still missing. Those who are familiar with the Rotterdam Convention, they know that quite a number of parties, they do not submit their import responses, which means under the convention, they would not be protected from any unwanted imports. But from the European Union side, we apply our explicit consent procedure also to those chemicals. So these were some examples how we implement the Rotterdam Convention, how we go beyond the Rotterdam Convention, and that we in fact in the PIC regulation followed the approach of the Rotterdam Convention, which is the exchange of information in order to give the importing countries the necessary information to decide themselves whether they would agree or not to the import of those chemicals that are banned or severely restricted in the European Union. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr.
beaucoup de votre présentation. On enchaîne tout de suite, donc je passe la parole à Monsieur Lefebvre, représentant de l'ECA, avant de passer à la DG Santé avec Monsieur Klaus Behrendt. Monsieur Lefebvre, la parole vous est donnée. Merci à vous.
Merci, Monsieur Andrieux. J'espère que vous m'entendez correctement et que vous pouvez voir mon écran. So, good afternoon to everyone. I will now present very briefly, one step further in details, the export notification procedure, because as it was presented...
we cannot see your screen yet, Mr. Lefebvre. We cannot see your screen. Can you again, please? Yes, now it's now it's working.
Thank you. So what I will be presenting is one step further into, as I said, the steps and contents of the information which is shared and made available regarding export notifications under the PIC procedure. Because as presented by Mr. Gabriel at the beginning of the session, the information at the basis of the study, which was conducted by Public Eye and Unearthed, are export notifications submitted under the PIC regulation. However, for those of you who are not very familiar with the European Chemicals Agency, I just wanted to briefly mention that ECHA is a new agency which was established in 2007, initially for the implementation of the REACH regulation, but has over the years been given tasks and responsibilities in the implementation of the main other EU legislations on chemicals, namely the classification, labeling and packaging regulation, biocidal product regulation, the PIC regulation on exports and imports of hazardous chemicals that we're discussing today, but also in other areas like persistent organic pollutants, nanomaterials, chemicals in products, etc. Now, if we are focusing on the PIC regulation and export notifications more specifically, it is first important to have in mind its main simple principles. First of all, it should be clear that export notifications are to be submitted by each EU company exporting or planning to export one or several substances that are listed under PIC regulation. notifications shall be submitted for each non-EU country to whom the EU exporter is planning to export its product, and irrespective of the use to be made of the PIC substance in that country. That was mentioned by Mr. Gabriel earlier. This means in practice that the substance that is banned for pesticide use in agriculture in Europe will still be notified even if the envisaged use of the substance in the importing country is not agriculture, but for instance, industrial. And we have in the PIC several substances that can indeed be used and therefore exported for both pesticide and industrial uses. Then export notifications have to be submitted on a yearly basis before the first export of the calendar year happens, and at least 35 days, calendar days before the actual foreseen date of shipment, in order to leave the process that I will present in a minute enough time to be completed, and ultimately also for the importing countries to receive the information early enough prior to the imports of the chemical on their territory. Export notifications are all submitted via a central IT system, which is called EPIC, and it's developed and maintained by ECHA. And as already mentioned by Mr. Gabriel earlier, therefore I won't go so much into the details now, export notifications consist in 4 main types of information to be provided. First of all, information on the identity of the PIC substance or of the mixture to be exported and that contains that substance. Then general information on the properties, hazard and risk of the PIC substance, as well as standard precautionary measures to reduce the risk of exposure of humans or emissions to the environment. Practical, concrete information on the export in itself, meaning the expected date of the first export to the importing country, indicative estimation of the total amounts of the substance or mixtures to be exported during the year, details about the foreseen use or uses of the substance in the importing country, as well as the names and contact details of the importers of the importing country, so that the authorities of the importing country can also liaise with these importers to get more information or follow the way they will be using the substance. Finally, an export notification also contains some background information on all the substance is regulated in the EU and the reasons why the substance was listed under PIC. If we focus now on the procedure for export notifications, it is made of 3 main steps and actors. First of all, from the left-hand side, an EU exporting company prepares and submits in the system that I've described before an export notification. Then the designated national authority of the EU member states in which the exporter is established checks the compliance of the export notification, and if needed, asks for its correction and resubmission. If the type or quality of the information is not aligned with the requirements, the resubmission is requested. When the substance also requires an explicit consent from the importing country before it can be exported, and if such consent has not been given already by the importing country, the designated national authority of the member state also triggers such a request. Finally, ECHA checks the compliance, if still needed, requires another resubmission, and then validates the export notification, which is basically giving the green light to the export. ECHA forwards then the export notification to the importing country only if a notification for this substance, PIC substance, and the category of use it concerns has not been addressed already. Now, if I look at what information is made already available on ECHA's website regarding this procedure. There you can find, on our website, you can find and search, first of all, the updated list of the PIC substances, so those which are subject to the export notification obligation. Also, the information about the designated national authorities dealing with PIC, not only in EU, but also outside the EU. And also some information about other procedures under the PIC that we haven't discussed today. Finally, you can, focusing to export notifications, you can also search for the export notifications and then perform different searches per importing country, name of the substance, the year, etc., to have to see what actually has been submitted and validated as export notifications. on top of that, we are also describing we are also displaying the annual reporting on pig exports and imports. So the actual exports or imports of pig substances that have been declared by companies, EU companies, for the previous year. Finally, I would like to stress briefly that among all its various activities in the implementation of the pig regulation, a major contribution of ECHA is also in providing the various actors involved in the process with support to make the procedures as impactful and efficient as possible. First of all, the EU exporters of pig substances, we provide and update our guidance and manuals, respond every year to an increasing number of helpdesk questions, communicate about the new substances and obligations, changes to the tool, etc. This is basically made to make sure that the information that is contained in the export notifications is compliant, useful, and understandable. To EU authorities, we are in contact also on a daily basis in the processing of certain specific export cases, but also when more general interpretation or implementation issues need to be clarified. To non-EU designated national authorities, we are exchanging also every week or even every day with some of them to help them dealing with the information that they are receiving from the EU in export notifications, and to help them clarifying technical or procedural issues in that regard. We also participate in support to the Commission and Member States in the meetings of the Conference of the Parties to the Rotterdam Convention and some related workshops, which also is another opportunity to liaise with the importing countries and clarify and try to solve any issues with the information that they are receiving from us. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Merci, merci à vous, monsieur Lefebvre, pour cette présentation. Et sans plus attendre, je passe la parole à la DG Santé, à la personne de Klaus Behrendt, donc, qui en est son directeur. Monsieur Behrendt, vous avez la parole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and also thank you to Angeliki, who will help me, or with Martin, who will help me sharing my presentation, which is very short because most of what needs to be said has already been said by my colleagues from DG Environment and from ECHA. Can we have the next slide, please? So Angeliki asked me in particular to say a few words on how MRLs are set, the maximum residue levels, and the basic principle is that MRLs are set following a comprehensive scientific assessment conducted by member states first and then by EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, based on a data package that demonstrates that the levels of the MRLs to be set are safe for consumers. And the same data requirements and the same stringency of assessment applies for MRLs that are set for domestic users in the EU and for imports. So when seeing the title of the seminar today, of the webinar, we had a bit of thoughts about that because at least for the setting of the MRLs, it's the same standards that apply for domestic production and for imports. When an active substance is no longer approved in the EU, and if this is due to concerns about human health, and in particular due to concerns from the residues, either if this risk is proven or if it cannot be excluded due to a lack of data, then no MRLs will be set, neither for domestic production nor for imports. Where it is possible to set MRLs for imports is when the concern that led to the non-approval in the EU was for environmental reasons. And then indeed, if the data package provided by companies allowed to conclude that the MRLs or that residues are safe for European consumers, it has been possible to set MRLs for imports. However, there is a significant new development in the context of the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy. The Commission has announced that it will take into account also environmental concerns when considering MRLs for imports. And this is something that we have just started to work on. Next slide, please. Now, to come back more precisely to the question of the exports of no longer approved active substances or plant protection products, Laurent Gabarel already noted correctly that this is not regulated by the Plant Protection Products Regulation, Regulation 1107/2009, because it only applies to the domestic use, and authorizations that are required for domestic use are not required for exports. However, exports of no longer approved active substances and PPP containing them are subject to the PIC regulation. And we have just heard a very detailed presentation on that from Jürgen Helbig from the Environment and Rémi Lefebvre from ECHA. So the export is only possible with the explicit consent of the importing country. And to stay with the example that Professor Bombardi has presented so much from Brazil, so exports to Brazil of such plant protection products are only possible when the government of Brazil has given the consent that this is okay from the perspective of the Brazilian authorities. Now, Laurent Gabarel also criticized internal sources in the Commission, having said that a ban of exports from the EU would not solve all the problems. Now, that is a fact. It's of course a decision, and Ms. Lepage has talked a lot about it, and also Angeliki and you, Mr. Chairman, have voiced support of a ban of exports from the EU of such products. But ultimately, this in itself will not solve the problem that these substances continue to be used in third countries, and that residues can occur in food imports because into the EU, because the third countries can source the substances elsewhere in other countries, such as China, for example, or India, or the United States, or Canada, to just name a few. So ultimately, what will solve the problem that is the topic of this webinar is, on the one hand, a refusal of the EU to set MRLs for imports from third countries, combined with convincing the third countries to stop using such substances. And this is exactly what is intended by the announcements in the Farm to Fork strategy and in the Green Deal. And Professor Bombardi also mentioned that in her presentation by saying that we should work, or by proposing that we should work towards international bans of the use of pesticides. There are some of these, in particular for substances that fall under the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants, but obviously there is indeed scope for more in this area. And obviously this is something that should be pursued at international level. And with the Green Deal and with the Farm to Fork strategy, the Commission has made it clear that it will work in this direction. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci, merci à vous trois pour vos interventions, même si, à ce qui me concerne, je les trouve assez surréalistes finalement dans le contexte dans lequel nous sommes. C'est vrai qu'il y a la tendance à travers le pacte vert, Farm to Fork et la stratégie biodiversité, nous laisse penser et envisager que les choses vont changer finalement ou s'améliorer, mais on voit bien cette espèce de quadrature du cercle finalement, où peut-être il faudra regarder aussi de plus près la question des accords de libre-échange, peut-être être beaucoup plus exigeant sur le contenu finalement de ces accords-là à l'avenir. Donc on voit bien que tout est lié, tout est dans tout, mais on ne peut pas continuer, comme on le disait dans le départ, à dire il faut que tout change pour que rien ne change. Parce qu'effectivement, là, nous sommes devant une réalité où il faut vraiment que ça change. Autrement, effectivement, les choses ne pourront pas donc s'améliorer ni ici, ni ailleurs. En tous les cas, c'est mon sentiment. Juste là, une réaction à chaud, je dirais, donc, qui n'est pas une question en soi, mais qui nous interroge à tous, et on verra à la fin comment on se propose de poursuivre ce travail-là à travers ce webinaire. Et là, je voudrais juste, je ne veux pas prendre la parole, même si on a envie donc, de réagir, bien sûr, céder la parole à Martin Dermine, qui a collecté un ensemble de questions pour voir si l'on peut les rassembler et amener quelques éléments de réponse, même si le temps court, qu'il faudra laisser à la fois comment dire, aux deux groupes de la GUE et des Verts de participer de la conclusion, donc, avec Ania Zekamp et Michel Rivasi. Donc, merci à Martin Dermine de nous donner quelques synthèses de questions posées pour voir si on peut amener rapidement quelques éléments de réponse. On est toujours frustré dans ces exercices-là, donc de ne pas pouvoir aller beaucoup plus loin, mais c'est ainsi. Voilà. Martin Dermine, la parole vous est passée.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, many questions related to trade agreements like Mercosur or with other Latin American countries. I'm not sure we do have the experts here around the table to discuss these agreements, unfortunately. So I will focus more on questions related to the presentation from Mr. Lefebvre and Mr. Helbig. It was more about the transparency and the available export notification, and also to obtain the names of the companies who export these chemicals in a more transparent way. So, Mr. Lefebvre, can I ask you if you can give more clarification on this, please?
Yes, I hope you can hear me now. Thank you for the question. So I saw that there were indeed several questions around this. So, so if export notifications are accessible on our website, the answer is yes, as I was putting a screenshot. You can search and find export notifications. However, it's true that you don't see all the export notifications as such, but a summary and some information coming from there. Before talking about the name of the companies, I would just like to remind that the information that is in the export notifications is sent to the importing country. So this information, which is primarily for the information, is available there. However, for the question on what is available at EU level, there is no clear indication of what should be regarded as public information in the PIC regulation. So only the manifestly non-confidential information contained in PIC submissions, including export notifications, is made publicly available. When for the rest, and the name of the companies is one of them, according to our meaning, when it was discussed at the moment of the implementation of the PIC regulation between Commission and the member states, the other information, like the name of the exporting companies, is treated as confidential business information, as it can reveal market shares and innovative uses. So this information at the moment is not made available. More generally, and not only about this, some of you might know that we are at the moment also reviewing, trying to assess the information that we are disseminating, or it is accessible and useful, and we are collecting some feedback via surveys to then see if we could present the information, the same, more different information in a maybe more meaningful and accessible way.
Thank you very much for your detailed answer. The next question is for Corinne Lepage about the French law to ban export of pesticides. It's can you also ban exports of active substances in order to avoid countries to assemble the pesticides elsewhere than in the EU?
À mon sens, non, mais c'est sous réserve, hein, parce que la compétence pour la substance active, c'est l'Union européenne. La compétence pour les autorisations de mise sur le marché, c'est national. Donc, on peut exiger des États qu'ils travaillent sur les produits mis sur le marché, et donc en interdire ou pas la production, la commercialisation, l'exportation, etc. Et le principe actif, je suis désolée, c'est le boulot de l'Europe. Et donc, c'est la Commission qui doit prendre la décision. Je ne crois pas, bon, il faudrait que j'y réfléchisse davantage, mais ma première réaction, c'est celle-là.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Madame Lepage. We have then an interesting question for Mr. Behrendt. So now we have this new green diplomacy included in the Green Deal. So who will be in charge of leading this diplomacy when it comes to pesticides?
Yes, thank you, Martin. I think that this question, I cannot answer it at the moment 100% conclusively, because we are just starting together with the other DGs to reflect on how to implement coherently all the international actions announced in the Farm to Fork under the Green Deal, because there are many, it's not just pesticides. What is most likely to be the solution is a sort of a steering committee made up of the different DGs that have the most at stake in this. And of course, this will include DG Sante, but also DG Trade, DG DEFCO, the External Action Service, and many others who have activities already also in the international environment. So this needs to be coordinated clearly, and it will involve many different DGs, not just one. Although, of course, we will have a stake in that. And my colleagues at international level, for example, are organizing just this week, and I think it's even tomorrow, an event with the missions from third countries in Brussels in order to explain a lot what is envisaged under the international volet of the Farm to Fork strategy. So many DGs will contribute to this, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Behrendt. I have a question for clarification to Laurent Gaborel from Public Eye on what active substances were studied in your study. Was it only the ones in the annex of the Rotterdam Convention, or all banned pesticides in the EU? So this is one thing. And the second thing is your opinion on how the EU could oblige changes in Mercosur countries in the frame of the free trade agreement. Thank you.
Yeah, on the first question, the scope of the research was all the pesticides banned in the EU. Under the Rotterdam Convention, you have about 30 plus pesticides listed in the EU. As it was explained, in fact, the legislation applies to a much broader range of pesticides. It applies to all the pesticides that have been banned within the EU. And we're talking of a list of about 170 banned pesticides subject to the PIC regulation, and our research showed that about 52 of those were exported in 2018, and about 41 were notified for exports for plant protection use in the third countries. About Mercosur, just to mention that in our view, this trade agreement will increase this kind of circle of poison, as we call it, in the sense that it will lower tariffs on the export of chemicals from the EU to Brazil. So it might lead to an increase in the exports of banned pesticides to Brazil as well. And it will also play the other way around, in the sense that it will lower tariffs on agricultural exports from Brazil to the EU. And in that sense, we might see an increase in food imports in the EU that contain a residue of banned pesticides. And if you just allow me a last point on this question that was on the chat on colonialism, whether it's a colonial to impose on importing countries what they're allowed to use or not. I would just like to say that colonialism has never been about enforcing respect for human rights or the environment. It has always been about exploitation, economic exploitation, and that's precisely what we're trying to end here. Economic exploitation of gaps and weaknesses of the regulation in many developing countries to sell very dangerous pesticides banned in the European Union. And I think the critical question here is exactly the one that was mentioned by many of the Commission, in the sense that, is it okay to export those chemicals if the importing countries consent? I mean, the importing countries are in many cases consenting to the imports, although I would disagree that that is the case in the majority of the case. In the majority of the case, I think they're just informed and not consenting explicitly. But is it okay to export those chemicals even with the consent of the countries? And in our view, it's not okay, because we're talking about pesticides that were considered too dangerous for use in the EU. So of course, they cannot be used safely in the other countries. And when you have this information, you should just stop selling. And just so that I'm not misunderstood, we recognize that the EU has one of the best laws in the world, even when it turns to international trade. It applies already the Rotterdam obligation to all its banned pesticides, and not only to the short list. And the farm to fork strategy is very ambitious in that regard, strengthening the MRL legislation, but also using this green diplomacy to promote a global phase out of those substances. But the third pillar that is missing is really this one, the ban on the export of banned pesticides.
I don't agree.
Thank you very much, Laurent, for your answer. Mr. Andrieux, can I still ask one last question before giving you the floor? Monsieur Andrieux, je peux poser une dernière question aux panélistes? Oui, merci. A question for clarification to Larissa Bombardi, and I think it would also be interesting to hear your view on the Mercosur and the impact it will have on Brazilians' health and the environment. And the question for clarification came from journalist Edie Wax, asking if from the deaths you mentioned of children and babies, if it was proven that it was linked to pesticides. And I suppose then it's me asking here clarification. It's only acute intoxications that were mentioned in your presentation and not chronic intoxications. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Do we still have the translator? No, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, we do.
No. Yes, okay, so I'm gonna reply em português. Sim, a maior parte destes casos de intoxicação são casos de intoxicação aguda. E nós não conseguimos, com os dados oficiais, saber qual foi a substância que causou determinação. Então, em termos gerais, nós temos estes casos de intoxicação aguda e sabemos que eles são só a ponta do iceberg, mas nós temos alguns estudos de caso, um deles feito numa área de produção de frutas, em que foi verificado casos de crianças com puberdade precoce. Uma das substâncias que levou a esse quadro de desregulação hormonal identificada pelos pesquisadores foi o acefato, que é uma substância proibida na União Europeia desde 2003. E quando esse estudo identificou puberdade precoce em crianças, não dizia respeito, por exemplo, à menstruação mais cedo, mas casos de crianças com 2 anos de idade que desenvolveram mamas e pelos pubianos. Então, infelizmente, em termos gerais, nós não conseguimos saber exatamente qual substância causou cada intoxicação em bebês, como nós temos esses números nos mapas, mas nos estudos de caso, em alguns estudos de caso feitos no Brasil, a gente consegue saber o que é que essas substâncias, uma parte muito grande delas proibidas na União Europeia, tem acarretado na saúde das crianças no Brasil.
Thank you, Miss Professor Bombardi. Monsieur Andrieux, je vous rends la parole.
Oui, merci Martin pour ce passage de relais et cette dernière intervention. Donc voilà, nous amène vers la fin avec beaucoup de, comment dire, de force pour nous inviter à poursuivre et le débat engagé, pour le traduire en action concrète. Et donc là, on approche de la fin, et avant de céder la parole à Anya Azekamp donc, et à Michel Rivasi, qui finalement sera à travers ses propos conclusifs, donc marquera la fin de ce webinaire. Je voulais profiter de ce moment pour vous annoncer ce que nous avons convenu finalement. Je parle au nom des trois co-organisateurs. C'est de faire une déclaration commune. Et le dernier témoignage nous y invite ô combien, donc, avec la situation qui est décrite au Brésil et que nous connaissons malheureusement les uns et les autres. Une déclaration commune avec tous les eurodéputés qui le souhaiteront, en demandant officiellement donc, à la Commission européenne, sur la base de 4 points, l'arrêt tout d'abord pur et simple des exportations de pesticides dangereux, ensuite la tolérance zéro des résidus de pesticides dans les aliments pour les pesticides interdits, le contrôle des résidus de pesticides sur les produits et la nourriture importés. Il n'y a effectivement que très peu de tests pour l'instant. Sur le peu qui a été testé, 6,5% des denrées dépassaient de beaucoup les limites de pesticides autorisés, ce qui nous semble effectivement totalement inacceptable. Et enfin, nous allons exiger que l'Europe, de manière officielle, soutienne l'interdiction mondiale des pesticides dangereux. Voilà à quoi nous allons inviter l'ensemble des eurodéputés donc, pour co-signer cette déclaration avant de l'envoyer donc, à toutes les autorités européennes. Voilà, c'est un petit peu ce que je voulais vous donner comme message. Le temps passe, on ne peut pas aller au-delà dans le débat, mais dans tous les cas, merci à vous toutes et à vous tous de votre contribution. J'espère que dans le cadre, effectivement, de Green Deal, de la stratégie biodiversité de Farm to Fork, nous allons aller bien au-delà de ce que nous avons réalisé jusqu'à présent, donc, et que les conclusions également de la commission pesticides, qui commencent à dater maintenant, seront traduites dans les faits, donc, afin que sur ce sujet, collectivement, et au regard des enjeux de santé humaine, dont vient de témoigner à nouveau Larissa Bombardi, que je remercie pour ses propos, nous puissions progresser collectivement. L'enjeu est d'envergure, donc il nous appartient aux uns et aux autres d'en mesurer la portée donc, et l'incidence en particulier sur le lien avec la santé humaine telle que ça vient d'être dit. Voilà. Et je cède la parole à Anya immédiatement en la remerciant avec Michel donc, d'avoir participé à cette organisation. Voilà. Et en vous remerciant à toutes et à tous également donc, aux interprètes qui ont permis que que les propos se déroulent pour le mieux. Voilà Anya, je te cède la parole. Et merci encore à vous toutes et à vous tous.
Well, thank you, Eric. Well, of course, I would like to thank my co-hosts, Eric Andrieu and Michel Rivasi as well. My name is Anja Hazekamp. I'm a member of the European Parliament for the Party for the Animals, Vice Chair of the Environment Committee, and also member of the Agriculture and Fisheries Committees. I would like to thank also PAN Europe and Public Eye for their support and their research. And of course, I would like to thank all the other speakers of today's event. We learned a lot about the use of pesticides around the world and about the double standards of the European Union. A zero pollution ambition for a toxic-free environment. That was one of the proudly announced ambitions of the Green Deal back in December last year. And today, there are still about 500 toxic active substances authorized for use in the European Union. And still, every month, toxic substances receive renewed authorization by the European Commission, despite the so-called toxic-free environment ambition of the Commission. And Commissioner Kyriakides has taken some small positive steps, for example, by urging member states to improve their action plans on sustainable pesticide use, and by urging member states to respect the deadlines for completing assessment procedures for the approval of renewal of toxic substances. But at the same time, we have to conclude that the actions taken so far are insufficient to achieve a toxic-free environment within the foreseeable future. To achieve that goal, we need a complete and immediate ban on pesticides that are threatening our health and our environment. And we can't turn a blind eye to the health crisis that we are facing. Furthermore, I would like to emphasize that the ambition to create a toxic-free environment should not only be a European ambition, but a global one, or rather a global right, a right to a toxic-free environment that should apply to all living beings. It is therefore a major point of concern that companies in the EU are still producing chemicals that are not approved for use within the European Union, but are exported to third countries. If a pesticide is dangerous here, then it's dangerous everywhere. Therefore, especially in countries that have less strict rules than the European Union, we should not export our banned pesticides. We need a zero tolerance level for food for hazardous pesticides, no matter if this food is produced inside or outside the European Union. Not only for consumer safety, but also for environmental safety. To achieve this, we urgently need to update the MRL legislation. I recently proposed to include an EU-wide ban on export of chemicals that are not approved for use in the European Union in the ENVI resolution on the chemical strategy. Unfortunately, that proposal was not adopted yet, but there are still a lot of opportunities ahead of us to push for a ban on exports of hazardous pesticides. Events like this one will help convince others of the necessity of such a ban. And I'd like to make one more remark, if I may. This morning, the Animal Welfare Intergroup discussed the EU-Mercosur trade deal. And at this event, Gabriel Casnati from the Regional Brazil Office of Public Services International told us that between August 2019 and August 2020, Brazil approved more than 600 new pesticides, and the Brazil Regulatory Agency considers 80% of those pesticides harmful to humans and animals. And we heard from Larissa Bombardi what the consequences for public health are. This shows that a toxic-free environment can not only be achieved without a complementary trade policy in which the precautionary principle should be leading. And we need to make our trading policy, including all free trade agreements, compatible with our own ambitions and our own commitments, such as the Green Deal. With the debates and the reports on the farm to fork strategy ahead of us, you can be sure that my group and my party will keep on fighting for the global right of toxic-free environment. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Ania. Donc, je dois excuser Michel Rivasi qui, effectivement, nous a fait part donc, de sa mauvaise connexion et qu'elle ne pouvait pas donc, participer ou, en tout cas, avoir les derniers mots. Donc, j'en profite de ces quelques secondes pour rappeler, ça vient d'être dit pour partie, que dans le cadre de la stratégie Farm to Fork, la Commission s'est engagée à promouvoir des alternatives aux pesticides et à promouvoir des systèmes alimentaires durables. Je crois qu'il faut bien mesurer l'enjeu qui est contenu dans ces engagements. Dans le cadre de REFIT également, elle a pris un engagement identique. Et dans les deux documents d'ailleurs, de REFIT et de Farm to Fork, il est dit de ne pas autoriser la tolérance à l'importation pour les pesticides interdits en raison de préoccupations humaines et environnementales. Jusqu'à présent, seules les préoccupations humaines étaient prises en compte. Je crois qu'on voit bien dans ces enjeux-là et dans ces évolutions que le temps est passé et maintenant de passer aux actes dans les faits, de traduire au-delà des grands objectifs par des mesures concrètes, donc les actes réels pour que les citoyens et l'environnement, qui n'ont que trop souffert des excès des industries pétrochimiques, puissent vraiment se retrouver dans les politiques publiques que nous devons mettre en œuvre. Merci donc à vous toutes et à vous tous pour vos diverses interventions, pour la coordination donc, et la qualité de vos propos. Voilà, je vous remercie. Et les choses ne s'arrêtent pas aujourd'hui, bien sûr, donc elles continuent et le combat ne doit pas s'arrêter maintenant. Merci beaucoup donc, et à très vite collectivement pour ce combat de la santé humaine universelle. Merci à vous. Au revoir.